Good morning, everyone. I'm Ian Gary. I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, or FACT Coalition. Welcome to our 2024 preview press briefing, and we're glad you can join us. The FACT Coalition is a US-based coalition of more than 100 civil society organizations, from anti-corruption groups to economic justice campaigners, environmental organizations, and labor unions. We're all united in efforts to combat corruption, financial secrecy, and tax dodging. While the US may continue to be perhaps the easiest place to hide dirty money, as Treasury Secretary Yellen reiterated in remarks last year, the US government is making important progress in combating the harms associated with dirty money and has taken concrete steps to address regulatory gaps which make it easy to launder money in the US. The global flow of dirty money, as well as the grand scale of tax dodging by multinational corporations, are threats to national security, democracy, fair economies, and the environment. This year, we'll see more than 2 billion voters in 50 countries, including the US, head to the polls, with many elections being held in questionable or failing democracies. In many countries, entrenched systems of corruption will undermine any serious expectation of a fresh start. Kleptocrats will try to protect their wealth and project power through illicit financial flows into rule of law economies. Financial systems enabling illicit financial flows must be reformed. This is at the heart of the work of the FACT Coalition. This year, the US is posed to put in place important new regulations to close major money laundering loopholes. I'm delighted today to present an excellent panel of FACT Coalition members and staff who will provide you with brief opening remarks highlighting recent and possible advances in a number of different issues, including fighting transnational bribery schemes, tackling anonymous corporate entities, enlisting gatekeepers to the financial system, such as lawyers and accountants, in the fight against money laundering, and cracking down on tax avoidance, evasion, and more. We'll take your questions after brief opening remarks, so please get your questions ready. First, I'll turn to Erica Hanachek, Government Affairs Director of the FACT Coalition, to discuss the implementation of the landmark Corporate Transparency Act, as well as other important anti-money laundering actions on the horizon. Erica?
Thanks, Ian, and thanks everyone for being here. It's an exciting time to be talking about these issues. There's such a convergence of progress in this space where the United States is properly rejecting being a home for the world's dirty cash. So I'm excited to talk about two opportunities, as Ian mentioned. The first to note is that the Corporate Transparency Act, the legislation that passed back in 2021 that would make entities declare their true beneficial owners to a database at Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, launched officially on January 1st. This is a major bipartisan 10-year-long effort to truly understand who is behind US entities. It's a major achievement and a new tool for law enforcement, financial institutions with customer due diligence obligations, and tax authorities to better understand and keep dirty money out of our system. The successful launch happened on January 1st. There were 100,000 entities that registered in the first week. And anecdotally, we've been hearing it takes about 10 to 20 minutes for businesses with simple ownership to file. And as a reminder, this is a really simple process. It's just a few simple pieces of information, including your name, your street address, your government ID, and your date of birth. So things that owners should truly know. You don't need a lawyer to file this information, and it's free. Now we're looking forward to its successful implementation, not only just to collect this information, but to make it actionable information for law enforcement. This will roll out in a matter of 4 phases. First, focusing on the Treasury Department. Next, opening up to state, local, and domestic federal law enforcement. Next, to international law enforcement via request of a US agency. And finally, for financial institutions with customer due diligence obligations. There's also another key important anti-money laundering rule coming down the way. Tom will talk about something monumental happening in real estate. But in addition, we're looking at potential rules as soon as next month to cover real estate, money laundering through the private investment sector. It's an $11 trillion sector with no safeguards. And like other actors in capital markets like banks and broker-dealers, It's been nearly 2 decades that the Treasury Department has considered bringing private investment advisors under the U.S. anti-money laundering safeguards, and it's finally coming to fruition. So I'm happy to speak a little bit more about that in questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Erica. Next, we're turning to Tom Cardamone. Tom is the Executive Director of Global Financial Integrity. And Tom, as Erica mentioned, will be discussing money laundering risks in the $50 trillion US real estate industry. These risks have largely gone unaddressed for decades. Tom, why is this a big deal, and what do you want to see Treasury do?
This is a big deal because we know it is real estate market, whether it's residential or commercial, is a prime way kleptocrats, organized criminal organizations, and other U.S. adversaries can launder money. In 2021, Global Financial Integrity published a report called Acres of Money Laundering that looked at primarily residential real estate and found that in the previous 5 years, some $2.3 billion was laundered through U.S. real estate. As you mentioned, the United States has no rules governing real estate as far as reporting requirements go. In just after 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed, which required banks, credit unions, and other money businesses to report suspicious activities. The real estate industry was exempt from that, given a temporary, so-called temporary exemption from that, which has pretty much held to this day. In 2016, the Treasury Department instituted what are known as geographic targeting orders. And what this required is that any purchase of residential real estate in specific geographic areas, usually larger cities, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, if LLCs or anonymous shell companies bought real estate with no financing, they would have to report. That, of course, left many, many gaps around the country. What we found in our 2021 report is that about 60% of the cases occurred in places where there was no geographic targeting order. Those have expanded over the years. Originally, there were about 10 or 12 jurisdictions covered. Now it's closer to 40 specific cities and counties, but it still leaves whole swaths of the country completely uncovered by this. We've seen tremendous impact for just regular people because of this activity. The condo collapse in Miami a couple of years ago, where 98 people died, we found that the financing for that, the investment for that probably came from drug cartel money and slipshod construction techniques, very little oversight resulted in that tragedy. And from an international perspective, the Kolomoisky case, the kleptocrat from Ukraine who laundered over $100 million in 8 states, 22 properties, left people injured in steel plants, businesses gone bankrupt, small businesses not being paid for services. So these really have a ripple effect around the country and can really impact individuals. What we've seen from the Biden administration is they've really sort of embraced this issue and are really trying to address it in a comprehensive way. In 2021, when they issued their anti-corruption strategy, they specifically mentioned the challenge of money laundering through real estate, which we found very encouraging. Just last month in December, it announced that they were going to issue a new rule. Treasury Department would issue a new rule on commercial real estate, residential real estate. There'll be a separate rule for commercial real estate later in the year, probably around October. So they've really tried to figure out what the best approach is. Of course, we in the FACT Coalition have our own ideas on what those rules should cover, and I'll just go over a couple of those quickly. One is essentially to create a nationwide rule, eliminate specific geographic areas. So Rapid City, South Dakota, and Miami are under the same sort of framework. There's a unified approach to this problem. So that would be one. Two, we would like to see a cascading level of responsibility to report a suspicious real estate transaction. As we all know, there are various sort of sub-industries involved in real estate purchases, whether it's title companies, escrow companies, real estate agents, attorneys, and so on. Lots of different individuals are involved in these. We would like to see specific language saying who is responsible in the first instance. If that particular person or subcategory of business is not involved, they go to the second one and then the third one. So ultimately, someone is responsible for reporting to Treasury that there may be a suspicious transaction happening. Third, we would like to see that various types of real estate transactions be reported, be included in these rules, not only ones that are non-financed, but also ones that where there's a non-sale transfer of property, or where a loan is provided but not from an institution that's required to provide AML reporting, such as a private equity loan of some sort. And of course, we would like to see trusts that purchase property also be included in the new rule. Last two would be that there should be no reporting thresholds. Right now, with the geographic targeting orders, there's a threshold of $300,000 in most places to trigger that type of a report. We would like to see that eliminated. You, of course, can launder money for less than $300,000. So we would like to see that gone. And lastly, some very basic information should be reported. Who are the beneficial owners of the entities buying the property? Who are the beneficial owners of the ones selling the property? Are politically exposed persons involved? Some very basic information that would allow law enforcement and others to understand what's actually happening in a particular transaction. So very briefly, that's a quick overview of where we stand at the current time. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Tom. I'll turn now to Gary Kallman, who is the Executive Director of Transparency International US. As I'm sure many of you know, Transparency International is a global movement focused on combating corruption. In the US, Gary, Congress just gave prosecutors a new tool to combat bribery outside the US. Could you talk about that tool, what this victory means and how it will work? And also, it'd be great to hear about potential for Congress to take further action this year related to the role of financial enablers or gatekeepers who work with individuals to access our US financial system.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And thanks everyone for joining. My colleagues have largely focused on what's happening in the administration because that's where people see opportunity. I have sort of the odd but I think interesting job of talking about progress that can and has been made in Congress. And so one of the things I guess I'd like to start by pointing out is that these issues, at least for the time being, and over the last several years, have been one of the few bipartisan issues that Congress has been able to make progress on. And I think that's sort of an exciting opportunity for us as we want to make progress on these global corruption issues. So let me jump in first with the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act. This is the anti-bribery law that Ian mentioned. This is a law that passed Congress late last year as part of the National Defense Spending Bill. What it does is it extends our foreign bribery laws. Right now, it's illegal for a U.S. company to go abroad and offer a bribe, but we don't hold accountable the people that are asking for the bribe, the corrupt officials around the world. And the problem with that is that it ends up with incomplete justice. And the impact of that for people on the ground is that if the U.S. company does the right thing and doesn't pay the bribe that's being demanded by the foreign official, but a company based in another jurisdiction that has less enforcement of its anti-bribery laws does pay the bribe, the impact on the local populations is the same. It could be to avoid local labor laws. It could be to avoid health and safety rules. It could be to avoid environmental degradation, which my colleague Julia is going to talk more about. And so if we want to actually say that we want a complete 360-degree protection against these kinds of impacts, then we need both abilities to punish the giver and the asker. It is, in fact, we believe it is the most significant expansion of our foreign anti-bribery laws since the passage of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the 70s. So that is done. It has been signed, and now we are looking to the Department of Justice to use this new tool and to implement it. And that, I think, is going to need to be carefully watched to make sure that this is something that is, it's not just a law sitting on the books. I will say one thing, as my colleagues from around the world at Transparency International and chapters in Latin America, Asia, Africa, we talked to them before pushing this law to see if they would welcome the U.S. government using this tool. And to a country, we have letters signed by a dozen or more chapters saying that this is necessary leverage that they need to make progress in their own country. Having the U.S. pass this law now provides a credible threat. I think there was an OECD study that said only 20% of corrupt officials demanding bribes are held accountable in their own countries. And so this gives the U.S. A new tool to go after those individuals and hold them accountable. All right, happy to answer more questions on that. But I do want to also pivot, building on the momentum from both the CTA a few years ago, the Corporate Transparency Act a few years ago that we're now implementing, as Erica said, the passage of the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act. This bipartisan coalition is now looking at another bill called the Enablers Act. And what that looks to close is another major loophole in our financial architecture. If you think about how this works, certainly somebody who tries to open a bank account, the banks have anti-money laundering responsibilities. Now with the Corporate Transparency Act, if they form a company in the United States, they now need to be reported. And so we're closing the loopholes that allowed it to dirty money to easily flow into the country. But let's say you have a Dubai bank account, you're a sanctioned Russian oligarch, you set up a company and a bank account in a jurisdiction that does not require any of these checks. You can still contact a U.S. lawyer, an accountant, a U.S. corporate service provider, and move money into the country to buy yachts, planes, and various kinds of investments that are not covered by the U.S. laws. And we've seen that in the difficulties in trying to track down some of the Russian oligarch money that's been sanctioned because there are what we consider to be the gatekeepers to the system or what we consider to be enablers. This bill almost passed in 2022. It fell short because of some opposition from some leadership on the Senate Banking Committee. Senator Patrick Toomey has now since retired, and we believe that there's a pathway to move this forward, which would be a very, very exciting development for the advancement of anti-corruption protections. I should say one last thing is that this is not new or radical. Many of our allies in the European Union already include these kinds of obligations, and we think it's time that they come to the U.S. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Now turn to Julia Yansura, who is FACT's Program Director for Environmental Crimes and Illicit Finance. Last October, FACT launched a new report called Dirty Money and the Destruction of the Amazon. Our report examined how the proceeds of environmental crimes can make their way into the U.S. financial system. So Julia, why do the reforms we've just discussed matter for the environment? And what are some of the specific reform measures you would hope to see in the coming year address the intersection of environmental crimes and dirty money?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I mean, environmental crime is big business around the world. We know that environmental crimes like illegal logging and illegal mining are actually the third largest type of criminal activity worldwide. And according to Interpol, this amounts to over $281 billion a year in illicit proceeds. Um, there's the environmental component where we're concerned about what this means for forests, for local communities, for access to clean water, for global warming. All of that is tremendously important. From a national security perspective, let's also take into consideration that these illicit proceeds, that $281 billion a year, is actually money in the pockets of organized crime, kleptocrats, and even terrorist organizations in many Latin American countries. As Ian mentions, our report, Dirty Money and the Destruction of the Amazon, found that a lot of the proceeds of environmental crime in the Amazon are unfortunately making their way into the US financial system, taking advantage of loopholes that we have around shell and front companies, real estate, and much more. As Erica mentioned, some of the loopholes around companies are fortunately being closed, but we're not 100% there yet. The US AML system has really serious loopholes and deficiencies that are making it, unfortunately, and even in the words of high-level US government officials, one of the easiest places in the world to launder money. In terms of some of the reforms that we would like to see, certainly robust implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act, the CTA, will help us to identify the real or beneficial owners of companies. That's hugely important to tackling environmental crime. There's also the Forest Act, which is a really exciting development, and maybe we can talk a little bit more later. There's also the matter of information exchange among countries. Many of these environmental crimes are transnational in nature, so it's not sufficient for the US alone to go about solving these, or Colombia alone to go about solving these. It simply will not work. And I think the bottom line is that this needs to be a bigger priority here in the US to address this. The flow of illicit funds, the proceeds of environmental crime into the US financial system should be a top concern for those of us concerned with the environment, but also for those of us concerned with issues of rule of law and national security. And happy to answer more questions later on about some of the details of those reforms.
Great. Thank you for that, Julia. And I want to remind folks that we will be opening the floor very shortly to questions. So use the Q&A function on Zoom to please submit your questions. Before we do that, just a few remarks from me on another major issue for the FACT Coalition, which is around multinational tax dodging and the need for greater transparency of the activities and tax practices of multinational companies. Having a two-tier tax system in which workers pay their taxes and rich multinationals find clever ways to dodge billions in taxes undermines our social compact and a sense of fairness. Tax dodging reduces the resources governments need to invest in communities and to show that democracy works for ordinary people. According to FACT member, the Institute for Tax and Economic Policy, in a recent report, quote, American corporations use accounting gimmicks that make profits appear to be earned in foreign jurisdictions that tax corporate profits very lightly or not at all. In 2020, American corporations claimed profits in 15 of these jurisdictions that were often far too high to be possible, in some cases much higher than that jurisdiction's own GDP. The US needs to work with other countries to reform the international tax system to close opportunities for profit shifting and other tax dodging strategies. The IRS is increasingly investing in enforcing the existing tax rules, with recent cases involving Coca-Cola, Microsoft, and others showing the potential cost to companies and investors of tax avoidance strategies that cross the line. For years, the FACT Coalition and others, including members of Congress, have been calling for increased transparency of multinational tax and other financial information. That call is now growing louder. And 2024 could be a year of transformational progress for so-called public country-by-country reporting by multinational companies. Just this month, a former Treasury tax official, Kim Clausing, testified in the Senate that public country-by-country reporting is, quote, very important and could lead to, quote, useful changes in multinational tax strategies. After the European Union passed a limited form of tax transparency a couple of years ago, Australia is now considering groundbreaking legislation that would require public reporting for many companies, including prominent US multinationals. Investors with over $10 trillion in assets under management have called for public country-by-country reporting because of the tax risks investors face and the extremely limited information available to them. Investors have filed shareholder proposals with prominent companies such as Amazon and Exxon, calling on them to reveal more about their tax practices. In the US, the Financial Accounting Standards Board last year agreed to stronger tax transparency standards, but these fall short of full public country-by-country reporting. All this momentum leads us to the need for the US Securities and Exchange Commission to put in place comprehensive reporting requirements to inform investors about material risks. SEC Chair Gensler has recognized this investor demand, and we hope to see further engagement and rulemaking by the SEC on this topic. Investors and the public should not be left in the dark. Now I'll turn to questions for the panel, and the first question, anybody could jump in, maybe Gary or Erica. Why are we seeing with these loopholes have been present for a very long time, loopholes and shell companies, real estate loopholes, investment advisors. Why are we seeing all of this sort of come to a head right now, and why are we getting breakthrough progress at this moment? Gary?
Okay, Eric, I'll start and then turn it over to you. I think there are a combination of factors that seem to have all come together in this great confluence of activity, beginning, I would have to say, with some of the investigative journalism that has come out, from the Panama Papers to the Pandora Papers, and to literally dozens, if not 100 studies or more, and investigative reporting that has shed light on exactly how big the problem is. When I started working on this issue maybe 15 years ago, one of the things we said was, hey, we think there could be as much as $50 billion moving around through an illicit finance system. And we were told that we were crazy, that's a wrong number. And the reason they said it was wrong was because we were inflating the number. Well, it turns out we were wrong. And studies from GFI and others have shown that the opposite is true, that it is far greater than the $50 billion. And so that's one piece of it. And I think the kind of reporting that we've seen has helped us galvanize. The other thing is, because of those stories, I think we've seen a coalition come together that's somewhat unique in the United States, certainly today. To pass the Corporate Transparency Act, we saw a coalition that included both civil rights organizations and the Fraternal Order of Police. We saw multinational companies and environmental groups working together. We saw the major banks coming together with the leading consumer protection organizations and consumer advocates that spend most of their time yelling or suing each other. And so understanding the breadth of the problem and how many assets or facets of our life, rather, that it impacts, has brought together an amazing coalition with the great work of exposés from journalism. There's more. Erica, let me turn it over to you to add.
Great, thanks, Gary. Completely agree with everything that you said. I think we're in a really unique moment for a couple of reasons. First, I think because of the tragedy in Ukraine and Russia's illegal invasion, there has been an incredible focus on trying to block the funds that Russia is using to commit human rights abuses and fight democracy in Ukraine. Because of that, there is a much better popular understanding. I go home to my home state of Missouri, and at my dinner table, I'm talking about illicit financial issues, not because I do this for my work, but because it's dominating the news, and there's a lot of attention and focus on how this money is moving transnationally through secrecy networks. And so I think because of the sanctions work and because of the investigative journalism that Gary mentioned, there's a much greater focus on these issues. Additionally, as Ian and Julia both pointed out, the United States has taken the unique step of admitting it has a dirty money problem. And the first step to recovery is admitting you have such a problem. So I think seeing that investment and attention from this administration has been really important. Particularly as we're looking at financial tools as a means of statecraft. This is what the United States is leaning on as part of its foreign policy around Russia, but also around the Middle East. It is really important that we get it right and make sure that we're not undermining our own sanctions posture by allowing that money to flow back into US markets. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there just to round out. So thanks.
Thanks, Erica. I want to turn to Tom now. First, Tom, just a clarification. So if you're the say a dictatorial ruler of the Gambia, and you wanted to hide some of the money you stole from the Gambian people in the U.S. In real estate, you could just do it right outside of an area where there's a GTO. So if DC is under a GTO, you could buy a house in Potomac, Maryland. Is that how it's working right now?
I think with the most recent GTO update in October, Potomac is now included as
Okay.
one of the areas, but your point is well taken. Yes, if you just go slightly outside those jurisdictional areas, you can buy very high-priced home or commercial property, whatever you'd like to do, and relatively easy to launder your money that way. If I could just add one thing onto the very good comments Gary and Erica just had to the previous question. The only thing I would add is there's also, I think, the contribution that we've seen our friends in Europe make to this issue over the years. The AML directives that they've passed several times, continually increasing their focus on this. Specific to the real estate issue, the United States is the only G7 country that does not require the real estate industry to report AML red flags. So we're sort of behind the curve as far as our closest friends and allies go. So that may be another reason, among all the good ones Gary and Erica mentioned, that may be pushing the Biden administration a little bit on this.
Great. If I could follow up with you, Tom, the issue of money laundering through real estate, how does that intersect at all with the affordable housing crisis in the U.S.? Does money laundering through real estate distort housing markets? And would you see that having these new regulations trying to deal with money laundering would have any impact, for example, on an average American's ability to buy a house?
I think it does impact housing prices because it can easily inflate the value of real estate. A very quick anecdote: I was on a train several years ago, overhearing real estate agents from Manhattan wondering why this Russian guy happened to spend $1 million over the market rate for a condo near Columbia University. And they had all sorts of theories, but none of them even get close to approaching money laundering. And so a money launderer isn't concerned about price, and so is willing to overpay for a particular piece of property, because when they sell it, then the money is cleaned. So that makes it more difficult for, if you want to use the phrase, regular Americans, the average American wage earner, to afford a property in a particular area. So that's how it distorts prices. As far as these new rules coming down the road, they most likely will have no impact on how the average person buys a home. The average person buys a home under their own name, not through an anonymous shell company. They also usually finance that home. They do not pay all cash. So these new rules and regulations that the Treasury Department is about to put forth probably have zero impact on the average person trying to buy a home or a condo.
Great. I'd like to turn to Julia now. Can you talk to us a bit about the dynamics in Congress related to environmental crimes? And is this a problem that you think Congress should care about? For example, what are the dynamics vis-a-vis environmental crimes in Latin America, and how does that play out in Congress? And then the second question is around the Forest Act, which I believe has bipartisan support in Congress. What's important about the Forest Act, and why does the FACT Coalition support that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there's growing awareness in U.S. Congress about why these issues are important. We still have a ways to go, but we're seeing folks from different political backgrounds kind of putting more attention on environmental crime, proceeds. I think that you can come at this from different angles. You can come at this from the environmental angle or from the climate change angle. You can also look at it from a national security lens and say, the US is supporting programming in Latin America to strengthen security, strengthen rule of law. That's all well and good, but we don't want to undermine that by allowing criminal groups to then launder dirty money in the US, right? So it's there are different ways that folks come at this issue, but I think it's getting increasing attention. With regards to the Forest Act, this is one of the most exciting developments that we're watching. It was reintroduced in November with bipartisan support into both the House and the Senate. So this is a really exciting development to watch. Basically, this builds on the Lacey Act, which prohibited the import of wildlife and timber products that came from illegal sources. This essentially, the Forest Act will make it illegal to import certain agricultural commodities that come from illegally deforested land. And here I will make the distinction illegally deforested. There are different types of deforestation. Deforestation can occur legally. Folks might have different views of that, but it can, occur legally with permits. Here we're talking about illegally deforested land. One of the things that we're most excited about with regard to the Forest Act is that it would, for the first time, make illegal deforestation a predicate offense for money laundering in the United States. So that would actually open up the toolbox and give US prosecutors who are, prosecuting environmental crimes, it gives them another tool to go after these environmental crimes that tend to be incredibly complex and very difficult and timely to prosecute. So anything we can do to make that a little bit easier is important. There's a common perception with environmental crime that these are low risk, high reward for the criminal groups involved, and we want to kind of shift that calculus and make it a little bit higher risk that they might actually get caught for what they are.
Great, thank you, Julia. I want to turn back to Erica around investment advisors. And you mentioned that there has been some work in the past to bring private investment advisors and the private investment sector writ large under anti-money laundering frameworks in the US, but these haven't gone through. Is that because there is a lot of risk in the private investment sector? What's changed since past attempts that have been made to extend anti-money laundering frameworks to this sector?
Thanks. So the administration first, well, let's take a step back. So after 9/11, as part of the Patriot Act, private investment was one of the categories of financial institutions that were under consideration for bringing under AML provisions. Not just under consideration, but initiated. Unfortunately, they received a temporary exemption at that time, same as real estate professionals, as Tom was alluding to. And 22 years later, that temporary exemption is still in place. There have been kind of fits and spurts about trying to regulate this sector. And in 2015, the Obama administration initiated a rulemaking, proposed it, but unfortunately, there wasn't quite enough momentum to get it across the finish line before the change in government. With that said, there's been plenty of evidence of risk to this sector, and it only continues to grow. The private investment sector is massive, opaque, and complex, which makes it the perfect place to stash illicit cash. And we see that in some of these examples. The organizations on this call co-produced a report in 2021 called Private Investments, Public Harm, in which we took a closer look at examples and evidence of abuse in the sector. So for instance, one firm, Zafira Capital, moved $100 million on behalf of Colombian cartels as part of a black market peso exchange through private investment. Likewise, Chinese state-owned enterprises provided venture capital investment in sensitive defense projects in Silicon Valley. And since we published that report, we've seen one of the most significant freezes that the Treasury Department has instituted against Suleiman Karimov, a verified BFF of Vladimir Putin, who is sanctioned by the US government, who was able to keep $1 billion in a Delaware trust that he later moved that money into the private investment sector, both before and after he was sanctioned. So it's really a massive problem, and we need to make sure that this rulemaking doesn't face the same lack of momentum from back in 2015. We need to finally plug this loophole in this sector.
Thanks, Erica. And I think related, I wanted to bring in a question from one of the reporters, which is that I heard there's a carve out in the Corporate Transparency Act exempting pooled investment vehicles like venture capital funds, hedge funds, and private equity funds from doing beneficial ownership reporting. How big an issue is that? Erica, would you like to talk to that, or Gary, perhaps?
I'm happy to speak to it and then open up to the group. So with the development of the Corporate Transparency Act, there are 23 exemptions in the law. Pretty much most exemptions are focused on making sure that businesses that are otherwise reporting their ownership, or it would be fairly easy for law enforcement to identify their ownership, aren't providing duplicative reporting to FinCEN. So for instance, an SEC registered firm, it's big, it's enormous, it's already filing with the SEC, it may not need to report its ownership to FinCEN. With that said, there are a couple of exemptions in the law we do find to be risky. I mentioned the risks in this sector. Pooled investment vehicles are something that we're taking a closer look at and consider a potentially risky exemption to the law, to the Corporate Transparency Act. This is something that authorities, the GAO and the Treasury Office of the Inspector General has to review these exemptions over time to make sure that any exemptions that exist aren't otherwise risky. And if they are risky, they can then consider whether or not these needs to be further addressed, but it's something that we're paying a lot of really close attention to. But overall, the law is strong. Despite these provisions that might provide a little bit of risk, it's a really meaningful tool for law enforcement for financial institutions. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
The only thing I might throw in is, I mean, it is a concern, and we do think it's a risk. I think that it makes the upcoming investment advisor role all the more important. And to make sure that that rule is comprehensive and covers all types of investment advisors. We don't want exemptions or carve-outs for smaller, those with smaller amounts of money, because people can divide up things, deposits and investments in a lot of different ways that are not all that difficult in a computerized age. So I do think that it puts more pressure on FinCEN to make sure that they get the investment advisor rule right. It's the only thing I would add.
Great. So Gary, I'll stick with you for a moment. The Transparency International's, one of their flagship research products just came out yesterday, I believe, the Corruption Perceptions Index. The CPI scores, offers scores around domestic corruption, but what does it say about the US and transnational corruption issues that we're talking about today?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the annual index came out yesterday. Just real quickly, the US scored a 69. That continues to be a stagnated score over the last several years. It's slightly up from 67, but that's not statistically, meaningful. And so on the domestic corruption front, there it is an indication, obviously better than many, but given who we are and the fact that we are a leading democracy, we should be better. The average score was 43, with 100 being the cleanest and 0 being the dirtiest. So I would just note that the world is, this is a troubling issue for the world and a challenge that we need to address, as a majority of countries are not above 50. But the report, as you say, Ian, does measure domestic forms of corruption rather than the issues we're talking today, which are more about transnational corruption. However, recognizing that a lot of advanced economies and Western democracies score well on this index, and many countries in the global South score low, there was a concern in looking at the types of issues that we're talking about. And so there's a feature in the report that was developed several years ago called Trouble at the Top, which refers to the countries that do score well, but in fact serve as financial centers that launder money. And there, the U.S. Has been called out a number of times. We've highlighted many of the problems that we've talked about today, about how we are facilitating where corruption may originate, and dirty money flows and illicit financial flows may originate elsewhere, but moving through the New Yorks and the Londons and the Switzerlands, that this is something that these countries need to acknowledge. And I think, as I can't remember, I think it was Tom who said, no, it was Julia who said that our Treasury Secretary has called the U.S. out as being one of the easiest places to launder money. So that section of the report, I think, is sort of a shout out and a warning to the advanced economy countries to make sure that we're not facilitating transnational corruption.
Okay, thanks. Well, one more question before we wrap up the conversation, unless reporters have other questions they want to put on the table. But one more question is around the role of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We haven't really talked about that too much, but they are obviously key to getting this work done, putting out proposed rules like the proposed rules we expect on real estate, on private investment, all of the work they did to put out the regulations to implement the Corporate Transparency Act. How much capacity does FinCEN have? What are its resource needs, and what should Congress be doing to give FinCEN the resources it needs to really do its job in an economy of the size of the United States? I wonder if, Erica, you'd like to jump in on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, just a reminder. So FinCEN is our financial crime fighters in the United States. So not only do they have all the rulemaking responsibilities that Ian highlighted, but additionally, they serve as the financial intelligence unit of the United States, making sure that we're identifying risks and making sure that we're able to find the dirty money that's in our system. So from both of those capacities, FinCEN plays a crucial role to make sure that dirty money stays out of our system. The United States is the largest economy in the world. We're the world's reserve currency. Yet our financial crime enforcement network is one of the most underfunded units for the size of the task that it has in front of it. For those interested, I do recommend that they look at Transparency International's report from a year or two ago called Up to the Task, that actually compares the United States financial intelligence unit against those from around the rest of the world. And the numbers are quite staggering. So Congress has a responsibility to make sure that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network has the resources it needs, not only in terms of being able to staff up, but also to make sure that we have the appropriate data licenses and technology to fight 21st century financial threats. I think the last note that I'll say is that Congress has a big task ahead of it. We're looking at forward to March 8th. Hopefully that we'll actually have a financial services and general government appropriations bill in hand. But really, our national security is at stake if FinCEN isn't able to get the resources it needs to do the job. So, it's an urgent call to make sure that we're able to appropriately close these loopholes, to make sure that we're appropriately tracking illicit finance in the United States and then tamping it down.
Great, thank you, Erica. We're going to bring the press briefing to a close. As you've seen, the FACT Coalition and its members, we have a deep bench of experts on these issues related to anti-money laundering, illicit financial flows, multinational tax issues, and tax transparency. And we expect a big year of progress and important events, including rulemakings coming out from the Treasury Department. So please do get back in touch with us if you'd like reactions to some of these developments that we expect to happen in the coming weeks and months. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and thanks a lot to the panel. Bye, everyone.